everyone, and welcome to our class on the 19th Amendment. We're beginning with a poem by Audre Lorde that kind of discusses feeling caught between the movement of feminism and the civil rights movement that we thought would be something nice to keep in the back of your head while we go through all of the complexities that come up for this amendment. There are so many roots to the tree of anger that sometimes the branches shatter before they bear. Sitting in Nedics, the women rally before the march, discussing the problematic girls they hire to make them free. An almost white counterman passes a waiting brother to serve them first, and the ladies neither notice nor reject the slighter pleasures of their slavery. But I, who am bound by my mirror as well as my bed, see causes in color as well as sex, and sit here wondering which me will survive all these liberations.
Okay, let's start by setting the scene with the historical backdrop for the suffrage movement. So, women had been excluded from the political sphere in the US long before the framers formally denied them the right to vote in the Constitution. Generally, only freeholders who were white male landowners had the right to vote. So, this also excluded all landowners whose land was not worth enough to qualify them as a freeholder. Only a few states allowed women to vote in local elections and town meetings, but this trend faded away when states began to do away with property qualifications for men and thus moved toward universal male suffrage. Women had several other hurdles to overcome before they could fight for the right to vote. Women's involvement in public discourse was not widely accepted. Married women had especially limited rights. These limitations included the inability to be party to contracts, the inability to sue and be sued, and the inability to own or control property. These restrictions made it extremely difficult for women to even begin a suffrage movement. For example, women, especially married women, could not rent facilities, print materials, or speak at events. So activists were focusing on gaining these basic economic and legal rights for women first and foremost. Okay, the suffrage movement really took off with the Seneca Falls Convention, which took place in Seneca Falls, New York on July 19th and 20th, 1848. At the convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled on the Declaration of Independence. It begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." This document advocated for women's suffrage and equal rights, which were mostly the economic and legal right that I previously mentioned, and was ratified on the second day of the convention. Because the women's rights movement was placed on the back burner during the Civil War, it lost traction during that time. After the Civil War, the Seneca Falls Convention became regarded as the beginning of the women's movement. This sentiment was manufactured to gain an edge against the abolitionist movement. Many suffragettes were angry that the 14th and 15th Amendments prioritized Black men over women in terms of the right to vote. Despite the positive narrative surrounding the Seneca Falls Convention, in reality, women of color, low-income women, and other minorities were excluded. In 1869, the women's suffrage movement split into two factions: the National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, AWSA. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were two of the early leaders of the NWSA. The NWSA opposed the 15th Amendment because it excluded women, took a federal approach, working towards a constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote, and also focused their efforts on gaining educational, legal, and economic rights for women. The NWSA was considered the more radical of the two factions. Lucy Stone was the first leader of the AWSA. The AWSA supported the 15th Amendment and took a state-level approach, working towards gaining the vote for women state by state. In 1890, the NWSA and AWSA merged into the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. This merger happened because of the huge surge in participation in the women's movement in the 1880s and 90s. The NWSA and the AWSA opted to capitalize on this support by joining forces, which added even more legitimacy and momentum to the women's movement. This new national organization was made up of smaller state and local groups. Women of color were not excluded at the federal level, but state and local branches of the organization could choose to exclude these women. The NAWSA was around for 30 years before dissolving in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. The NAWSA adopted a state-level approach, which meant working towards getting the vote for women state by state. Western states were the first to give women the right to vote. This trend could be explained by the lack of women on the frontier, so it wouldn't really make that much of a difference for the people living in these states and wouldn't be much of a change, or by the effort to encourage more people to move out west. In the early 1900s, the NAWSA began to expand their scope and worked towards getting women the right to vote in a larger variety of states. In 1913, just 7 years before the 19th Amendment was passed, Alice Paul, who worked with the suffrage movement in England, founded a rival party called the National Woman's Party, or NWP. The NWP adopted a more confrontational style than the NAWSA, which attracted a younger demographic of supporters. This party took a federal approach, working to get a constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. In 1917, shortly after the election of Carrie Chapman Catt to her second term as president of the NAWSA, the NAWSA shifted to a federal approach and came out in support of the US involvement in World War I. These activists argued that the fight to make the world safer for democracy started at home, and that to fully step into their new role in society as workers and volunteers, women needed the right to vote. The 19th Amendment finally made its way through Congress and was officially ratified on August 26, 1920. The next hurdle in the fight for equality was to get women elected to local, state, and national office. Next, we will be discussing the lesser-known heroes of the women's movement.
So first, we just wanted to highlight a few of the Black feminists from the articles that everyone read. So Sojourner Truth ran away from her slave owner with her infant daughter after the passage of the New York anti-slavery law of 1827. She became an advocate for abolition, temperance, and civil and women's rights. As a result of her Civil War work, she was invited to meet President Abraham Lincoln. Sojourner Truth was also a preacher and compelling speaker, delivering her famous Ain't I a Woman speech in 1851. This speech challenged prevailing notions of racial and gender inferiority and inequality. She believed that suffrage for formerly enslaved men and women should occur simultaneously. Next, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper delivered a visionary speech on the relationship between African American women and women's rights at the founding meeting of the American Equal Rights Association in 1866. She believed deeply in interracial collaboration, but committed to it on the condition that white women treat Black women as equals. Harper also delivered a famous speech in New York about race, gender, and racism faced by Black women as a women's issue that suffragists were obligated to confront. The ideas communicated by Harper in this speech anticipated by more than a century the intersectional legal analysis of the critical race theorist Crenshaw. Mary Ann Shadd Cary was the first female African American newspaper editor in North America and the second African American woman in the United States to earn a law degree. She fled to Canada after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 and started a school there for Black and white children, editing her paper. She returned to the US when the Civil War started. She earned her law degree and worked for women's rights, testifying at one point before the US House Judiciary Committee on Women and the Vote. And then lastly, we have Ida B. Wells, who was an investigative journalist, women's rights activist, and anti-lynching crusader. She was freed from slavery at 6 months old when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. Wells researched and wrote a Red Record to share data and uncover the stories of lynching in America. She was confronted with racism from white suffragists upon wanting to join their organizations. So she founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, Chicago's first club for Black women fighting for the right to vote. White suffragists told her that women of color were to march in the back, but she refused to be intimidated and marched at the front of the line with a delegation of Illinois suffragists and appeared on the cover of the Chicago Tribune. And this is a copy of that Chicago Tribune cover, and you can see that she's in the front of the line marching with the white feminists. Next, I just kind of wanted to highlight a few of the points in the Reading the Myth of Seneca Falls. So we chose this piece because we thought it did a good job of highlighting the fact that Black women ended up being invisible in the fight between priority for the vote between Black men and white women. So at the beginning, it kind of discusses Stanton and Anthony teaming up with George Francis Train. Train was a Democrat that supported white women's suffrage, but not Black suffrage, and therefore he was at odds with the goals of the AERA, which Helen kind of gave us the rundown of the history with the organization. So in working with Train, this further revealed the willingness of Stanton and Anthony to prioritize white women's voting over that of Blacks, and all of this is discussed on page 24. So we'd love to have some kind of feedback in the discussion over that point. So Lucy Stone and other AERA allies were shocked when Stanton and Anthony turned their journey home into a speaking tour with Train. And they began speaking to audiences from Kansas and New York. And they were billing these stops as AERA fundraisers, even though Train was in opposition to Black civil rights, which was a stated goal of the organization. They also started their newspaper, The Revolution, which was promised by Train. And here is where Train and Stanton advocated for educated suffrage. Next, on page 29 of that reading, there was a quote from Frederick Douglass that I found to be very powerful. And then Anthony's response to that quote from Douglass was that the question of priority between women and Black men should never have been introduced in the first place. Then the piece kind of talks about that split that Helen had went over, where we had the National Women's Suffrage Association with Stanton and Anthony and the American Women's Suffrage Association. So again, any feedback on that would be great. Then it talks about the aftermath of that split into the American and National Associations. There was a need for union that was stressed by many women, which is what led to Tilton's unification petition drive. So the hope there was that members from both of those associations would convene to effect a merger, which ended up being unsuccessful, but Anthony kind of took the lead there. So it was more Stone and the American Association that appeared to be the roadblock to the unity. Then after the Civil War, Americans began to argue over how the Civil War should be remembered. And on page 38 of the piece, the viewpoints of abolitionists, white supremacists and African Americans was discussed, and how the contributions of women had been forgotten in these in post-war memory culture and political culture. So abolitionist remembrances forgot to include the contributions of women. And on page 40, there's some examples of this. Women were largely responsible for collecting signatures on petitions for the eradication of slavery. They boycotted slave-made products, and they raised money through fairs and bazaars. The women saw this quote-unquote forgetfulness as being connected to the refusal of some male abolitionists to support women's voting rights after the war. So Davis's convention had a National Turn Union Association stamp on it, and she herself supported Stanton and Anthony. She opposed abolitionist memory claims by arguing that the women's rights movement was more historic than anti-slavery. And she was also already on record opposing Black men voting before white women. She condemned Stone and her colleagues for being on the wrong side of history. And then Stanton and Anthony were both absent from some of the first national women's rights conventions, but their rivals, such as Stone, were present at nearly all of them. So this ended up leading to a divide over when this movement truly started. Davis's convention failed to unify the suffragists as it had hoped, and then ultimately the Seneca Falls Convention had no significance in the accounts of Davis, Anthony, or Tilton. So any of that stuff I just presented, it would be great to get some discussion going on those points.
All right, an article was published by the ACLU called Celebrate Women's Suffrage, but Don't Whitewash the Movement's Racism. And the article asks us how we reconcile this celebration of the 19th Amendment with all these widespread stories about triumph and women's rights and marching towards equality against the more complicated and painful reality of the lived experience of the Black woman. And this is a theme that we still see today. The author, Tammy Brown, shares the story of her 94-year-old great aunt who grew up in Alabama, where Black people were disenfranchised from voting by poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright violence and intimidation. And to be a Black citizen in America, even after they had the right to vote, but were still denied full citizenship rights, epitomized the hypocrisy of American democracy. Of course, we see this today with gerrymandering and our prison and criminal justice system too. Brown's aunt actually moved to Cincinnati, yay, and she cast her first vote in Cincinnati when she was 20 years old. And Brown actually gives us an answer to this question of reconciliation, and she says it's in Kimberly Crenshaw, someone we're really familiar with in this class. She says that we must apply intersectionality to answer this question and apply intersectionality to all historical narratives. We know that racism and sexism intersect in a manner that compounds Black women's oppression. And although Seneca Falls and the 19th Amendment and those historical events around the 19th Amendment occurred long before Crenshaw, this theory should still be applied to all historical narratives that do not fully engage with the lived experiences of African American women. And when we take an intersectional view of Seneca Falls, what do we see? When suffragists gathered at Seneca Falls, they advocated for white women's right to vote. They were mostly middle class and upper class white women. There were some white men there who supported the suffragists, and Frederick Douglass, as we've already mentioned, was also present. And they did have a strong working relationship, but there were no Black women present, and no Black women were invited. The history of women's suffrage in America is not nice or neat, says Brown, because the impact of white supremacy is broad, and we know that humans in our history, especially in America, is really messy and ugly, And so she urges us to constantly acknowledge the truth and to engage in an intersectional celebration of women's rights, these activists, and the landmark events. And she gives us a kind of push at the end for how we can move forward and celebrate this amazing accomplishment without whitewashing what happened. And so she says to keep these discussions going, and I think we've done a good job of that in this course, and to celebrate and learn from Black suffragists and modern leaders and modern Black politicians, especially Black women, and moving forward to support new movements like Black Lives Matter and other groups who are fighting for justice, especially around voting rights and prison reform.
So now we wanted to shed light on some of the LGBTQ plus representation that there was in the suffrage movement, but that there's not a lot of discussion on, even though there's definitely evidence of it. One quote from one of the articles we found on this topic that I thought was powerful was, "These women were not just fighting for themselves, but for their beloved." And I think that kind of shows you maybe why some of these leaders in the movement were so passionate about suffrage for women, because these were women, you know, that may be in relationships with other women, so they knew they couldn't rely on men for their privilege and agency in order to be provided for. And so it was important to make sure they could vote, as well as have access to things such as financial independence and education and career opportunities. So at the same time as championing suffrage for women, some of these leaders also worked towards financial support for single mothers and maximum hour and minimum wage legislation for women workers. By 1911, numerous women in relationships with other women had prominent positions in the movement, such as Jane Addams and Anna Howard Shaw. And these relationships, we would call them lesbian-like now. I don't know exactly what language they would have used then, but it was often derogatory. They were called mannish or unsexed, as it says here, but there's definitely evidence of it, and there are many letters which were discussed in some of the articles we found that, you know, expressed affection towards their women they were in relationships with. One of the most notable pairs at this time was Carrie Chapman Catt and Mary Molly Garrett. They had a 30-year relationship, even though Catt married twice. That didn't stop her from this relationship with a woman that was seen through letters to be affectionate and a loving relationship. Both of them were instrumental in the movement. Catt was president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and Hay was president of the New York Equal Suffrage League, and Catt was actually instrumental in finally getting the 19th Amendment passed. So these relationships were pretty common. Susan B. Anthony had a few with socialites such as Emily Gross, who were involved in the suffrage movement. But today we might classify, you know, these leaders, these women, as bisexual, since they did have, you know, some of them were married, such as Catt, but they had relationships with women throughout their time in the movement. And we think that may have, you know, when you have so many women in your life and in this way, that will fuel your passion to fight for equality for yourself and those you love. And so now we kind of get into kind of the uglier side of things just during this, because, well, first during, and this is just kind of continuing with the intersectional lens of viewing all of this. So at first, in the Declaration of Sentiments, which we discussed earlier, these women were insisting that all men and women are. But later they emphasized the differences between the sexes, and they sort of used that to argue why women should vote, saying that it would clean up the dirty, corrupt politics. But the ugly side of that was also emphasizing differences in race, class, and ethnicity. They, by the 1890s, some began to advocate for educated suffrage, which involved literacy requirements for voting, which would, keep African Americans, working class citizens, immigrants from casting ballots. And that is something that, needs to be remembered during this 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, especially when such difficulties in voting still exist today. And but of course, these women were, facing a lot of backlash themselves, and opponents of the movement for suffrage for women, they depicted these women as unattractive and man-hating, which, still happens to feminists. It did, throughout the 20th century and still today. And to counter such stereotypes, suffragettes did sort of try to promote conventional femininity. Shaw, who we discussed earlier, she had been called mannish, and she kind of fought against that. She grew her hair out when it had been short before because she didn't want to hurt the cause. So she kind of had to go against how she felt most comfortable because she wanted to, be as effective as a public leader of the movement as she could.
As members of the Immigrants Protective League and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, both Breckinridge and Adams rejected exclusionary strategies. And so this is where we get the good stuff with intersectionality. Adams protested proposed literacy tests for immigrants, and Breckinridge co-authored a report advocating for education rather than employment for working class youth, which was really important at this time. The new lesbian leadership team also welcomed African American participation in the movement. And W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of the NAACP publication The Crisis, had publicly criticized the NAWSA's racism, warning that the movement's mission was becoming votes for white women only. And he also published numerous editorials and articles in support of women's suffrage, especially for Black women. Breckinridge advocated inviting Du Bois to speak at the suffrage organization's 1912 meeting, and his participation signaled the NAWSA's growing commitment to racial equality. In 1911, NAWSA had refused to allow a resolution linking women's suffrage with African American rights to be presented at its annual meeting. However, the next year, they published one of Du Bois' speeches called Disenfranchisement, which did just that, advocating for a democracy of sex and color. And this lesbian leadership team lasted for only a year, but while it operated, these leaders made the suffrage movement more diverse and inclusive. And finally, the 2020 Women's Vote Centennial Initiative is the organization that was created to serve as a central organizing and information sharing entity to celebrate the 19th Amendment and the anniversary. So they've been pushing a lot of programs, projects, and activities to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, especially education initiatives about legal and social advances resulting from the amendment, and to stimulate dialogue to address the ongoing fight for women's rights. And they've taken a pretty intersectional lens, which I thought was great. And their website has a lot of resources. And there's some recommended readings, many of which are intersectional and share some of the lesser known stories about suffragists of color and lesbian suffragists. And they also have a really cool Instagram that they keep pretty updated. with pictures and stories and news. They have a little gift shop, and they have a bunch of events and programs, which, yeah, sadly, a lot of them have been canceled. But we have a little quiz here about the suffrage movement and the 19th Amendment. So this is a great way to pass some time in quarantine. And we hope that you all learn something and can take something positive from this presentation and can celebrate the 19th Amendment with this fresh perspective. And make sure you all vote in the primary. Thanks.